Alright, let's look at the next part of the Lord of the Rings. These are the next 3 chapters in the Two Towers, chapters 4 to 6 of Book 1, or Book 3 of Lord of the Rings, Book 1 of the 2 that's in the Two Towers. One thing to keep in mind as I'm looking ahead, there are 11 chapters in Book 3, the first half of the Two Towers. So if I'm doing 1 to 3 as a video, 4 to 6 as a video, this video, then we either get a chapters 7 to 9 video and then a 10-11 video, or we do a 7 to 11 video. I think I'd prefer to do that, so probably the next video after this will be chapter 7 to 11. Let's see what there was to say in chapters 4 to 6. I take a lot of notes because otherwise I'll forget things that I noticed and wanted to say. So starting with chapter 4, Treebeard. Of course, you know, just in the experience of reading this for the content, it's pretty different from the movies here. The image of where Treebeard lives seems a lot more mountainous than what I remember from the movies, which didn't seem particularly steep as the landscape around him seems to be here in the book. Also, I appreciated that on page 463, at least page 463 as it is in this edition, we get an actual description of an ent, which seems a little bit more humanoid maybe than what we see in the movie, which is more of a literal walking tree. This seems more like a person with tree-ish features who's very tall. But anyway, one of the most interesting things about these chapters is actually some Old English words that come up, and one of the foremost is ent. Now, one of the places that we see ent pretty often is in a place like Beowulf, where we have this phrase enta yawerk, work of ents, used of ruins, particularly impressive ruins. So, a long time ago, Simon Roper and I began reading Beowulf together on this channel in Old English, or, well, going back and forth between my channel and his channel. We have fallen off from that. Perhaps it's something we'll get back to, perhaps something I'll finish on my own. We'll see. But you actually see this pretty often in Beowulf. It looks like twice in Beowulf here, and then as Enta Yawerk, and then let's see, line 1679. Oh, same thing, Enta Yawerk, early work of Ents. Not used of ruins there, but actually used of an ancient sword. So, with Ents apparently being something in the Old English imagination like an elf, perhaps, right? Some kind of mythical, vague, but apparently somewhat positive creature. The name may be related to Old Norse Jotun, of course, which is for enemies of the gods, quote-unquote giants, but it doesn't seem to have that negative valence in Old English. Now, there's another poem, much lesser known in Old English, called Maxims 2, and that has a line that's a little bit surprising, maybe. Let me see if I can pull this up. As I recall, it's actually Orthonc enta Yawerk. Now, Orthonc in Old English is like cunning. Here's the Old English text. Let's see if I'm right about that, or if I just quoted this at you out of nowhere. No, okay, let's see. Orthonc enta Yawerk. This phrase is somewhere. Oh yeah, absolutely it is. I just couldn't search for it in this online version, so for a moment I thought I was misleading you, and it turns out I wasn't. Anyway, so orthonc is something like uh, cunning, right? So, right, it's thunk, like thought, um, and actually related to English thank. Um, so like cunning thought, even potentially verging on deceitful thought. So Saruman is the man of deceit, of engines, of manipulation, of craftiness, who lives in his tower of, crafty thought, surrounded by his yard of iron, his enclosed place of iron. So Saruman in Orthanc and Isengard. It's all very Old English. We get a fair amount of Old English names here. Now, I think that's because the Ents and Saruman live close to the Rohirrim, whose language is represented as Old English, but worth noting. We also have, Treebeard recites this whole list. Learn now the lore of living creatures first named before the free peoples, etc., etc. This looks like Old English poetry. That looks like the meter of Beowulf, what an Old Norse scholar would call Fornir the Slag, the meter we call Fornir the Slag in Old Norse. In Scandinavian editions and in my own editions and translations of these poems, we typically represent what Tolkien represents as a line as two lines, but he represents this the more traditional English way, where learn now the lore of living creatures is one line. As I would represent that, or as most Scandinavian editors would represent that, would be learn now the lore, next line, of living creatures. It could be a difference between editions. But at any rate, the alliterative pattern there is very much that of Fornir the Slag, or an Old English poem like Beowulf, an Old Saxon poem like Heliond, and Old High German poem like Hildebrandslied. Fangorn says to the hobbits, you call yourselves, quote, you call yourselves hobbits, but you should not go telling just anybody. You'll be letting out your own right names if you're not careful, off quote. Not a unusual thought from the standpoint of medieval literature, where your true name needs to be protected. Also kind of a Dungeons and Dragons thing, right? Reminds me of Falkness Mall in the Poetic Edda, where Fafnir the dragon asks Sigurdur, who killed him, what his name is. Sigurdur says, I won't tell you, and then tells him, probably because him saying initially, I won't tell you, is their way of clumsily indicating internal monologue. We have another kind of linguist fantasy quote here. Quote, real names tell you the story of the things they belong to in my language, off quote. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of things that linguists think they tell people that excites them, but of course people just, their eyes just glaze over when we say that kind of thing. What else do we have here? We have something that, I did look this up in the appendix because there was a footnote that said to, Fangorn says something in Quenya, Taure li lomea tumba lemorna tumba letare lomeanor. The appendix says this is Quenya treated in agglutinating intic fashion. So I guess this is like a pigeonized Quenya that takes the, I think, already somewhat Finnish-like grammar of Quenya and makes it more agglutinating, makes it more Turkish or something. Interesting thought. Of course, Tolkien would think about that kind of thing. By the way, just occurred to me something I don't think I've ever mentioned, but that a lot of people might have questions about. The E that is two dots that you see all the time in Tolkien's work is supposed to be pronounced separately on its own. So when he puts an E at the end of a word and puts two dots above it, that means pronounce the E. When he puts it in a word like Lomeanor, but the E has dots above it and then there's an A, it means pronounce those are two different vowels. Don't pronounce it as a diphthong. Don't pronounce it, pronounce A-A. Then Fangorn has this whole other song that he sings, which is very different metrically, in the willow meads of Tassarinan, I walked in the spring, etc., etc. This did not look very much like any sort of Germanic meter that I'm familiar with. If anything, the poem with its like artfully repeated elements reminded me a little bit of something from the Old Testament. So it seemed like a pretty different style that he all of a sudden adopted. Maybe that's supposed to be more like Intish style. I don't know. Treebeard says that the place he lives could be called Welling Hall in the Hobbit's language, I guess meaning like the hall where things well up. Oh, and of course he talks about the Ent wives. So initially I thought, well, that must mean Ent women, right, with the Old English sense of wife, weef, meaning just woman, although later he does say the word elf, or not elf, Ent maiden, so I guess it actually does mean the wives of the Ents. He is using it in the modern sense. I was primed to hear it in the Old English then. I still don't know how orcs work, as Fangorn says that he wonders if the orcs that work for Saruman, quote, are they men he has ruined, or has he blended the races of orcs and men, off quote. Okay, don't know how that works. And then a lot of world building as Fangorn talks about the past of the Ents and the Ent wives. He has the song between the Ent man and Ent wife, where the Ent wife says, quote, when spring has come to garth and field, off quote. She's not talking about spring coming to a country singer, but to the literal meaning of garth, Old Norse garðr, Old English jert, the enclosure, right, the yard, the area around the house. Fangorn talks about an Ent moot. Of course, moot is an old noun form of the verb meet. When you meet someone, that's a moot. A moot is a time when people meet, or a place where people meet. Some pretentious bars and such have names like a moot house, right, like meeting house. The really surprising word that was used here, and I still actually haven't even looked it up, I'm going to look it up live, is dingle. So Treebeard says that he lives in a place they meet in a place men called Dern Dingle. Well, Dern I know is hidden from Old English or German. I actually don't know what the dingle is. All right, my dictionary on my Apple says it is a deep wooded valley or dell. So what would I call that here? A canyon, I suppose. But Tolkien uses it a lot. He talks about, quote, descending into a great dingle, off quote. This word caught me by surprise. I couldn't think for a moment what it means, but apparently, according to the dictionary in my Apple, it's unknown etymology, so that's not surprising. And then the Ents meet and decide they're going to fight Saruman. We hear more stuff that makes me confused about how all these different creatures work. Quote, trolls are only counterfeits made by the enemy in the great darkness and mockery of Ents as orcs were of elves, off quote. Like, don't know how he made trolls or made orcs. All that's kind of left to the imagination, I suppose, or maybe talked about in the Silmarillion somewhere. All right, this chapter 4. Come back and talk about 5 and 6 after a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. All right, in chapter 5, we have Aragorn say, quote, I cannot read the riddle, off quote. Of course, that's a pretty old sense of read. We in modern English use read mostly in the sense of, read the book. But the original sense of this verb is really counsel, advise. When you read something, you are advising what it says, right, to someone else perhaps, or advising yourself. When you read the riddle, you are taking counsel about what the riddle means. So a pretty old sense of that pretty simple seeming verb. I thought that Gandalf coming back as Gandalf the White was another thing where I didn't understand the mechanism of magic in this world exactly, but he still sounds kind of Odinic, quote, above the hood he wore a wide-brimmed hat, off quote. So he still seems to be pretty obviously in appearance based on Odin, for whatever reason. He's a very different figure than Odin in Norse myth, right? Odin wants to harvest men who die in battle to assist him in his great fight at Ragnarok, Gandalf is a much more benevolent figure. We get a lot of high-flown language here. Quote, power was in his hand, off quote. I don't know what that means, but it seems cool. Seems kind of vaguely Old English in sense. I have no idea what Gandalf means when he says, quote, indeed I am Saruman, off quote. Gandalf says, quote, the enemy, of course, has long known that the ring is abroad, off quote. That is an archaic sense of abroad, meaning on the road, at Old Norse, oabreut. So literally, it's not at home somewhere. It's traveling, right? It's on the move. Not that it's just in another country. I thought that the sense of stay when Legolas says to Gandalf, quote, can you not stay even to tell your friends how you were delivered, off quote, was a little bit archaic, meaning like delay, not just remain standing or something like that. Gandalf also uses a pretty archaic adverb or adverbial use of a noun when he says, quote, long time I fell, off quote. Of course, this is almost like an ablative of duration in English or something like that. In present-day English, I think we would have to say, I fell a long time. But that almost, again, like adverbial or ablatival use of time there strikes me as kind of archaic. Also, Gandalf says, quote, far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things, off quote. Reminds me of how, of course, in Norse myth, Nidhogger and other serpents in Grímnismál, Odin says more than any fool can count are gnawing the roots of Yggdrasil. We hear about a place called Silvertine. That sounds like Silver Summit. I think it's exactly what it's supposed to imply, where Gandalf rose to the tops to fight against the Balrog. I don't have any great sense of what a Balrog is, but that's most of what I thought with 5, although when Gimli says, quote, since Gandalf's head is now sacred, let us find one that is right to cleave, off quote. I wonder what exactly makes it sacred, what sacred means in this context. Surely I'm an idiot for not quite knowing that, but part of the world building that Tolkien does, of course, is giving his characters opinions that we wouldn't know the full context of, right? It's part of, I think, of even a seemingly casual comment like that carries with it the implication of, an education in a culture that we don't have access to. It's clever world building, I think, even while it makes me wonder what I don't know here. By chapter 6, I was thinking, the book is moving at a really good pace. It's very readable here in this part of the Two Towers. I think this has been probably this was the best just reading so far. The narrative's good. It really emphasizes in how long and deliberately paced it is that the right thing to do may be hard and long. It's a bitter but true thought with my fiance getting fired right before Christmas. And I was trying to figure out what to do. So we've got the King of the Golden Hall. We hear, quote, the light of it shines far over the land. Before that, quote, and it seems to my eyes that it is thatched with gold, off quote. Sounds a little bit like the description of the temple at Uppsala, as Adam of Bremen describes it, the last of the great pagan temples in Scandinavia, potentially. Thatched with gold, because that would be expensive and impractical, really meant, just golden colored thatch. But I think here it actually is literally thatched with gold, roofed with gold, as English thatch is cognate with Old Norse dak, modern Icelandic dak, the roof, modern Norwegian tak. Gandalf says, quote, "We are come with the rising of the day," off quote. Of course, archaic use of intransitive verbs like come, go, with the verb to be rather than have when they're used in a perfective sense. So we are come, we are gone, not we have come, we have gone. More like German or Icelandic, a little bit more archaic Germanic language syntax. We get another Old English word, simbelmune, the flowers that grow on the graves of the Rohirric kings. Of course, Gandalf translates it ever mind, right? Forever remember, forever, ever memory. Tolkien waxes rhapsodic about Old English, I think, because he has Legolas say, quote, "That, I guess, is the language of the Rohirrim, for it is like to this land itself, rich and rolling in part, and else hard and stern as the mountains, but I cannot guess what it means, save that it is laden with the sadness of mortal men," off quote. And then Aragorn translates it into modern English or common speech, and we get kind of an ubi sunt poem, right? Where now the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm, etc. Very common trope in medieval literature, or even almost genre of medieval literature, the ubi sunt poem, ubi sunt being Latin for where are. We get these quite a bit in Old English, where is, this, that, and the other. Its last poems like The Wanderer and the Seafarer have a lot of elements of an ubi sunt poem. One of them has some ubi sunt wording, where is, or where sinned, where are. I can't remember which one. I always confuse those two poems. Get some more Old English names. Felarof, father of horses. Felarof, I think this is really fast. Father of horses strikes me as a phrase. It's not very Old Norse or Old English. Again, it sounds kind of vaguely Old Testament to me. But Tolkien obviously likes combining a lot of elements of different cultures. It looks like the Rohirrim call Minas Tirith Mundborg, so hand fortress is how I would take that. And we hear that the great horses of the Rohirrim are the Mearas, word related to modern English mare, which means female horse, but the masculine mare is used of other horses, not just mares in Old English. Of course, Theoden has his, assistant, Wormtongue. Wormtongue is a nickname that we actually see in Old Norse in a somewhat different context than this. Gunlaugr Ormstunga, so Gunlaug, Wormtongue, Serpent Tongue, Snake Tongue is really what this means, because they don't distinguish between legless creatures. He's not evil-tongued in the Old Norse saga about him, which I've covered on a video summary that I did on this channel some years ago. Rather, he is, he's biting-tongued, right? He's caustic, right? He has a sense of humor and belittling that comes through in his poems about others. I was a little bit surprised to see some names of the Rohirrim spelled with acute accents, like Theoden with an accent over the E, Hama with an accent over the A. To me, that looks like Old Norse orthography. I'm used to modern editors of Old English writing macrons, right, long flat lines instead of the diagonal acute mark. To me, it makes Old English look a little bit more Old Norse-like. I don't dislike that. I just think that it's unusual. Maybe that was more common in Tolkien's day. I suppose I've seen that in older editions of Old English works. We hear, I think this is Wormtongue, or it might be Theoden. I guess it's Theoden. Says, quote, "News from afar is seldom sooth," off quote, sooth, S-O-O-T-H. Of course, that's Old English. Truth, true. The soothsayer is the true sayer. Forsooth is for sure, right, truly. Not a word one would expect to encounter very much in modern English. Theodred, the son of Theoden, that would be like horse not horse, People's Council, Counselor of the People, Council for the People. We hear the Rohirrim call Lothlorien Dweimordena, so like the seat, Dale, maybe Magic Dale, something like that. We have Wormtongue. Wormtongue is Grima, son of Galmode. Grima strikes me as a pretty normal Old English type name, like the masked one, hooded one, not really having a negative implication in Old English or Old Norse. Galmode almost looks like that could be, maybe I'm being too Scandinavian influenced by this, but like his dad's name being like crazy mind, crazy mood. That may mean something else in Old English, but that's the first thing that strikes me reading it as a Old English, Old Norse guy. Eowyn, her name means horse joy. Eowyn. Eo, by the way, this Old English word for horse is a poetic word for horse in Old English, although used in names like this. The Old Norse cognate is Yor, which we also see in names, mostly women's names like Jofridr, horse beautiful. This is actually the Old Indo-European word for horse. This is cognate with Latin equus. The Gothic has ech. So what's happened is that qua in Proto-Indo-European, which is preserved in Latin, or becomes a P in Greek hippos, becomes an H by Grimm's Law in Germanic languages, so we get Gothic ehwas. But the hua between vowels is going to always drop in Old English and Old Norse. The E at the beginning is going to become a y consonant sound in Old Norse, but not in Old English, so Ao versus yor. But that's where that word comes from. The English word horse that we're used to is primarily is the old word for thinking of the horse as a vehicle, right? It's actually cognate, bizarrely enough, with the Gaulish or otherwise Celtic word that becomes Latin carus, right, the wagon, and that's borrowed back into English as car. It's horse and car from the same Indo-European root. Anyway. We get another couple Old English names, Brego, son of Eorl. I think it's basically two words for prince, prince, son of prince. Gandalf says, quote, doom hangs still on a thread, off quote, must be the old sense of doom, being judgment, right, the outcome of things. We get another poem that looks like Forne the Slag or the Meter of Beowulf, Arise Now, Arise, Riders of Theoden, etc. The only thing that's surprising here is that you have alliteration on non-first syllables, because of course in English, arise, the emphasis is on the second syllable, but most words in Old English and all words in Old Norse are emphasized on the first syllable. Eomer greets Theoden saying, Westu Theoden Hall, off quote, that is, be well, Theoden. Typical greeting in Old English. Sometimes you see West Hal rather than West Hall, just dialectal variants. We hear about Grima, quote, Loth was he to render up the keys, off quote, Loth, reluctant, related to loathe. He loathed the idea of doing so. Wormtongue says to Theoden, quote, your meat is about to be set on the board, off quote. So to turn that into modern English, your food is about to be set on the table. Meat having in earlier times the sense of any food, right? Icelandic mat or Norwegian mat. Board having the sense of table, right? Icelandic borð, Norwegian bord. We hear from Theoden that Grima's, quote, leechcraft ear long would have had me walking on all fours like a beast, off quote. Leechcraft, of course, leech is not just a leech, it's a doctor, a healer. That's why the creature is called leech, right? Cognate words are still used in Scandinavian languages to mean doctor. Icelandic leiknir, Norwegian lega. Ear long, ERE, of course, ERE, ears is before. pretty common archaic word in books like this. There's a lot here. Obviously, with all this Old English stuff. Theoden says of Shadowfax, quote, "In him one of the mighty steeds of old has returned," off quote. So it made me wonder about, how resurrection of horses, or reincarnation of horses works into the theology here. But I guess sentiments like that might be common among people who don't literally believe in reincarnation. Eowyn says, "Fare through Theoden Hall," so Theoden, go healthy, travel healthy, when she brings him wine. Actually, we do hear about wine in old Germanic sources, like Old English poems. I know in the Helion that it gets mentioned. Wine probably is a native word in Germanic. It probably is inherited from Proto-Indo-European. My colleague Dr. Luke Gordon has done a lot of work on this question. They might mean things like berry wine, apple wine, some kind of fruit wine rather than, grapes. But and we hear about the Erlingas, so that would mean descendants of Erl. These Ingas names in Old English, or Ungar names in Old Norse, like Volsungar, descendants of Volsungur, Volsi, Gjukengar, descendants of Gjuki. Those suffixes just mean, descendants of the family that comes from so-and-so. The king has a horse named Snowmane. I was surprised that it wasn't, Snowfax, but okay. And then lastly, Gandalf gets called Greyhame. So gray cover, gray skin, gray appearance, probably really just gray appearance here because he clothes himself in gray. Well, that's a fair amount out of those 3 chapters. If you're reading along, again, I'll probably do chapters 7 to 11 of the Two Towers, book 3 next time. And appreciate the support for this channel out there. Appreciate the folks who support it on Patreon, the folks visiting the Amazon shop to help with small commissions by buying your books there. And at any rate, from beautiful Colorado, I hope you know that I'm wishing you all the best.
All right, Professor. We're on the way. Oh no, this is terrible lighting. No.